This is rejected knowledge, and these shall be the last two chapters. This is the final part of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. From about 1917-ish was when this was written. Chapter 36, Governor Sulzer's Impeachment and Tammany's Defeat, 1913 to 1914. The campaign of retaliation against Governor Sulzer soon came to a climax. On July 15, 1913, a committee called the Frawley Committee, headed by Senator Frawley, was appointed to inquire into Governor Sulzer's receipts and expenditures of campaign funds. After taking testimony, that committee submitted its report with the finding that, following his campaign for governor, Mr. Sulzer had omitted declaring in his campaign statement $19,000 of contributions to his campaign fund, and had purchased, for his personal account, stocks with part of the monies thus received. The evidence, according to the committee's report, showed that a total of $109,016 in cash or stock had been in Mr. Sulzer's possession, and that this sum came from campaign contributions. Mr. Sulzer had used both cash and checks to purchase stocks, and as far as could be brought out by the records and testimony, his Wall Street transactions with 3 brokerage firms covered a total of $72,428.28, dating from January 1st, 1912. It appeared that the greater part of these payments were made after he became a candidate for governor and was elected to that office. Mr. Murphy and other Tammany leaders pointed out that while these very transactions had been going on, Mr. Sulzer had, in his public speeches, pretended that he was a poor man. Mr. Sulzer's own version was that if he had made a mistake in signing his campaign statement, it was due to haste and carelessness, and not to intent to deceive. But, he added, this is not the only explanation of the failure to itemize certain monies which were received in the campaign. Some of the monies were not for campaign purposes at all, but were loans. They were given to me by friends who knew I was heavily in debt, and who loaned me the money to pay my debts or to use as I saw fit. These friends wanted nothing, and in case of my election, I knew there was nothing they would ask me to do, or that I could do for them. Politics had nothing to do with the matter. All the monies given to me, or sent to me for the campaign, were turned over to the committee, to which reference has been made, or were subsequently given to Mr. Murphy. Whether the latter turned these monies over to the State Committee or not, I cannot say, but an investigation of the report filed by that committee negatives the assumption." Unquote. On August 13, 1913, the Assembly, by a vote of 79 to 45, impeached Governor Sulzer on 8 articles. Trial by the High Court for the trial of impeachments, consisting of the State Senate and the judges of the Court of Appeals, followed. Governor Sulzer vigorously fought back, and public opinion was greatly aroused over his charges that the affair was simply a case of the Tammany organization summarily disciplining him for refusing to be its tool. Sounds like it to me. He was convicted on 3 of the 8 articles of impeachment. 1, that he had filed with the Secretary of State a false sworn statement of his campaign receipts and expenditures. 2. Perjury in swearing to the truth of the campaign accounting. 3. Committing a misdemeanor in suppressing evidence and preventing or seeking to prevent witnesses from appearing before the Legislative Committee. On October 17, 1913, Governor Sulzer was removed from office by a vote of 43 to 12 by the High Court for the trial of impeachments. It should be noted that Chief Justice Edgar M. Cullen of the Court of Appeals, who presided at the trial, voted to acquit Mr. Sulzer on every one of the articles. Said Chief Justice Cullen, quote, "Never before the present case has it been attempted to impeach a public officer for acts committed when he was not an officer of the state," unquote. Chief Justice Cullen held that Mr. Sulzer had committed no offense in failing to state the amounts and sources of his campaign contributions, and that there was no evidence of any deceit or fraud. Governor Sulzer's supporters set forth the following as the main actual reasons why proceedings for his removal were pushed. First, Mr. Sulzer's persistent efforts to secure the enactment of the full crew legislation to conserve human life on the railroads. Second, Mr. Sulzer's success in securing the enactment of the laws that he recommended to compel honest dealings on the New York Stock Exchange. Third, Mr. Sulzer's refusal to approve the McKee Public Schools bills, which would have given control of public schools to a religious denomination. Ding, 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 ding. Can you guess which religious denomination, folks? I gotta look this one up. Bang! Look at that. Look at that. Rome got him, folks. I'll look it up and make sure, but I'm gonna bet my dollar it was Rome that got him. Rome forced him out. So you can easily infer that Rome, in some way, is in cahoots with Tammany Hall, or was. Whoa! Okay. Of course, if you read the works of many American authors in the late 1800s, there was a furor going on in America about Rome undermining and co-opting and attacking our American public schools at the time, which were of a different nature than the American public schools today. Okay, continuing. Fourth, Mr. Sulzer's successful efforts in causing the repeal of the notorious charter of the Long Salt Development Company, by which the state of New York received back its greatest water power and the most valuable of its natural resources. Fifth, Mr. Sulzer's defiance of the bosses, big and little, and his fight for honest and genuine direct primaries. It sounds like the state got a decent, honest governor for one of the I'm sure rare times in any state in American history. They got a good governor, and of course he's going to get thrown out. He was an honest man. It sounds like. You can't be honest in politics. No wonder they got rid of the guy. You can't stand up to the gangs and the bosses and Rome and the stock exchange. You can't do it. The guy never stood a chance. Sixth, Mr. Sulzer's determined refusal to be a proxy governor or, quote-unquote, a rubber stamp. Seventh, Mr. Sulzer's absolute refusal to follow boss dictation regarding legislation and appointments, and his blunt refusal to call off Blake and Hennessy and stopped the investigations which were being made under his direction to uncover fraud and expose graft in the State Departments. Eighth, Mr. Sulzer's moral courage in the performance of public duty, wherein he insisted on the trial and punishment of Senator Stilwell for extortion. Ninth, Mr. Sulzer's determination to set in motion the machinery of the law in various counties of the state to indict the grafters and bring them to justice. There could be no questioning that the proceedings against Sulzer had an effect upon the public mind, the reverse of that expected by Boss Murphy and his advisers. The attempt of Tammany Hall's leaders to pose in this case as the conservers of political virtue met with a sardonic reception and quickly reacted upon them in unmistakable terms. Public opinion in general made no attempt to mitigate Mr. Sulzer's acts, but with a keen perception of the fundamental facts, it saw that the real reason why Governor Sulzer was so brutally punished was not because of those acts, but because he had finally broken away from Tammany dictation and had sought to be somewhat of an independent governor. Every intelligent person knew that this was his crime in the view of the Tammany organization, and according to Tammany standards, the worst crime that could be committed. That an organization which had been steeped in corruption and graft should so ostentatiously pretend to be the exposer and punisher of infractions in an official who had defied its power, excited mockery, resentment, and indignation. The people were smarter back then, weren't they? Public sympathy turned toward the deposed governor, and he was nominated for the Assembly by the Progressives in an East Side district. As we have seen, one of the chief issues upon which Gaynor had made his mayoralty campaign in 1909 was for municipally built and operated subways. After becoming mayor, he underwent a decided change of mind. The subway rights were awarded to the Interborough Rapid Transit Company and the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company. The final report of the Joint Legislative Committee appointed to investigate the Public Service Commissions severely criticizes the policy and the terms under which the contracts were made by the Public Service Commission and the Board of Estimate. On the other hand, defenders of the Board of Estimate's action point out that the reasons why that board changed from city to company subways were that by the cooperation of the companies, the city had the benefit of $150 million more in funds than would have been the case without that cooperation. That the new subway lines, instead of being independent, disconnected routes, unrelated to existing transportation lines, would be built in appropriate extenso of subway facilities already in operation. I don't know if extenso is a type error there, folks. It says extenso. And that by this arrangement, not only would the service be harmonized and improved, but the payment of double fares would be done away with, and an aggregate of vast sums thus saved to the traveling public. The circular routes by which the city's transportation problems will be more effectively and constructively solved were adopted despite gainers favoring the Interborough Rapid Transit Company's perpendicular routes plan. One feature of the testimony later before the Joint Legislative Committee, especially attracting public attention, was the imputation that in the contract for the third tracking of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company's elevated railroads, a fund of $2 million was surreptitiously provided in the form of a commission to John F. Stevens. Formerly, Mr. Stevens had been associated in the construction of the Panama Canal with Mr. Shantz, who was now president of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company. This company, in the third tracking work, wanted exemption from supervision by the Public Service Commission. According to a memorandum preserved by George W. Young, an Interborough director, this contract with Mr. Stevens was entered into, so it was asserted, Mr. Shantz told Mr. Lane, another director, because, quote, in connection with the securing of the contract which had been closed between the City of Greater New York and the Interborough, Mr. Shantz had found it necessary to make certain commitments and incur certain obligations, and that it was by means of the Stevens contract that he expected to meet and pay these commitments and obligations. End quote. The Joint Legislative Committee thus comments on the testimony, quote, it is absolutely clear that Mr. Shantz did tell Mr. Lane something about commitments and obligations in respect to this strange proposition. It is equally clear that he was not under any business commitment or honorable obligation to Mr. Stevens. He made a request of the Public Service Commission chairman for an exception from the general contract, relieving third tracking from official supervision, and had told the reason for it in his desire to give the contract to Mr. Stevens. He did not obtain exemption from supervision, and that applied to the contractor to whom finally the contract was awarded. End quote. The chairman of the Public Service Commission here referred to was Edward E. McCall. Whatever may be the shadowy implications conveyed in this report, no statement is made that any corruption was used, nor is any proof presented that any official was improperly influenced. The salient fact was that McCall, in an era when corporation activities were more and more rigorously scrutinized by official bodies, should have reverted to bygone standards and graciously allowed a removal of that very supervision which it was expected the Public Service Commission would insist upon exercising. Tammany Hall's nominee in the municipal campaign of 1913 was this same Edward E. McCall. When an attorney, Mr. McCall had been connected with certain operations of the New York Life Insurance Company, of which corporation his brother, John A. McCall, was president. It appeared from the testimony before the Legislative Insurance Investigating Committee in 1905 that Edward E. McCall had given notes totaling about $10,000 to Andy Hamilton, the chief legislative lobbyist at Albany of that company, and the distributor of the quote-unquote Yellow Dog Fund. Precisely why Edward E. McCall should have given those notes was not explained. Hamilton received great sums in all for legislative purposes. In the transferring of some of the sums, Edward E. McCall figured. Both Edward E. McCall and Andy Hamilton received, quote, excessive remuneration, unquote, from the New York Life Insurance Company, apparently for legal services in a certain case, which sums, according to the report of Charles E. Hughes, there was no adequate reason for paying. At the same time that these sums were paid to them, both Edward E. McCall and Hamilton were under a regular retainer as attorneys by the New York Life Insurance Company, each of them receiving $10,000 a year. Mr. McCall was put upon the Supreme Court bench in 1902 by Tammany backing, and remained there until his appointment in 1913 by Governor Sulzer as chairman of the Public Service Commission, 1st District. The greatest exertions were made by Tammany to sway the electorate so as to swing the election in its favor. Tammany realized that the Sulzer episode would be an important issue, but it did not anticipate that the summary removal of Governor Sulzer, with all the attendant circumstances, would make so unpleasant an impression, driving large numbers of voters to the other side. Tammany thought that it had put Sulzer on the defensive. It did not quite foresee the effect of revelations which, before the campaign was over, placed Tammany seriously on the defensive, and its leaders under the necessity of making explanations. Moreover, in selecting its candidates and developing its campaign tactics, Tammany did not appreciate the very much altered attitude of a large section of the public toward municipal politics. There had arisen in New York City an increased public demand for proved administrative capacity. The old days of public toleration of choosing politicians for quote-unquote good fellowship or subservient qualities had about gone. The emphasis was now placed by Tammany's opponents upon the fact that cities should not be merely governed, but well governed by men of vision, ability, and integrity. Come on. You really believe that? Gus ended his incongruously ended the other book I read by him on an incongruous positive note. It sounds like it's drifting towards that here. Well, let's see. The candidate for mayor of the Republicans and Fusionists was John Peroy Mitchell, a young independent Democrat who was credited with having made a notable record as Commissioner of Accounts. Later, he had been president of the Board of Aldermen and then collector of the Port of New York. Nominated with him were William A. Prendergast for comptroller and George McEnany for president of the Board of Aldermen. All were eulogized by their supporters with having served the city with constructive ability and marked efficiency, and with having opposed and exposed Tammany, graft, and extravagance. The Socialist Party's candidate for mayor was Charles Edward Russell, a writer of note and a man of high personal character. Full of bitterness was this campaign. Perhaps the most effective speakers against Tammany Hall were John A. Hennessy and former Governor Sulzer. Mr. Hennessy, in a public speech on October 23, 1913, specifically charged that he held a note for $35,000 that had been signed by a justice of the Supreme Court who had been Mr. Murphy's alternative candidate for mayor. Quote, I do not say that the $35,000 was ever paid to anybody. I don't suspect him of any vices that would induce him to borrow $35,000. If he has had to pay $35,000 or more for his Supreme Court nomination, why, he simply followed a tradition in the organization to which he belonged. Unquote. Mr. Hennessy charged Mr. McCall with not answering the question of where he got his campaign money, and asked Mr. McCall whether, in 1902, when McCall was candidate for the Supreme Court nomination, he, McCall, had not met George W. Plunkett, a Tammany district leader, the originator of the term, quote-unquote, honest graft, in a room in the Hoffman House, and whether Anthony N. Brady was not in another room at the same time. Mr. Hennessy continued, quote, I want to ask Judge McCall whether his sponsor, Charles Murphy, had not seen Anthony Brady in respect to McCall's nomination in the Hoffman House, and I want to ask Judge McCall if the gentleman who brought him and Plunkett together to discuss that nomination did not have something to do with Murphy and Mr. Brady in respect to that nomination. Unquote. Mr. Hennessy charged that one man that Mr. McCall paid was Plunkett, but he, Hennessy, did not know whether he paid Murphy or whether he paid the amount to somebody who paid Murphy. But he, Hennessy, did not undertake to assert that. The Anthony N. Brady here mentioned was a traction magnate who, beginning as a clerk in Albany, had, by means of legislative manipulation, giving richly valuable railway and other franchises, accumulated an estate of $90 million. In several speeches, Mr. Hennessy pointedly asserted that James Stewart, a contractor, had paid $25,000 to a former friend of Charles F. Murphy, and inquired whether J. Sergeant Cram, a prominent Tammany light, had not received $5,000, and Norman E. Mack another $5,000. At a public meeting on October 25, 1913, Mr. Sulzer declared that he had sent to Charles F. Murphy $10,000 that Allen Ryan, Thomas F. Ryan's son, had contributed to his campaign fund, and that Mr. Murphy had never accounted for it. Mr. Sulzer named John H. Delaney, parentheses, later State Commissioner of the Department of Efficiency and Economy, end parentheses, named John H. Delaney as the messenger who had carried the $10,000 in bills to Mr. Murphy. This money, Mr. Sulzer asserted, had originally been handed to him, Sulzer, in his New York office by Mr. McGlone, Allen Ryan's secretary, and that he, Sulzer, gave the $10,000 to Delaney, who took it uptown and gave it to Murphy. Mr. Sulzer continued, quote, late that afternoon, I saw Mr. Murphy at Delmonico's. During our conversation, I said, did John give you the 10 from Ryan? Mr. Murphy replied, yes, that's all right, but it's only a drop in the bucket. You'll have to do better than that. So far as I know, unquote, Mr. Sulzer continued, quote, and I am pretty well advised, Mr. Murphy never accounted for that $10,000 any more than he accounted for the Brady $25,000, which I refused, and which he accepted from Judge Beardsley, Brady's legal representative. At all events, I think Mr. Murphy should tell the voters what he did with the money." Unquote. Mr. Sulzer declared that he, Sulzer, was still in debt, and that, quote, "I am a poorer man today than I was when I became a candidate for governor." Unquote. No one acquainted with Sulzer's career could doubt that, had he been essentially corrupt, he could have become a millionaire from huckstering of legislation when he was Speaker of the Assembly. There was no bribing him, however, with money. He was, in fact, a poor man. Mr. Sulzer then declared that Thomas F. Ryan was Boss Murphy's master. This, in fact, was the very point made by the Socialists, that the political bosses were only the tools of the great financial and industrial magnates. Thank you, Gus Myers. This is exactly what that hack history writer, the book by Kenneth something, the book about Boss Murphy I was telling you guys about, it blamed it all on Boss Murphy and portrayed the bankers, on the rare occasions it did mention the bankers, the Astors and whatnot, as they were saying, "Oh no, Boss Murphy, don't do that. That's bad." Oh yeah, but it's the other way around. The political bosses are only the tools of the great financial and industrial magnates. Thank you, Gus Myers, and the Socialists back then did have that right. Continuing. And that where the political bosses gathered in their millions, the magnates accumulated their tens or hundreds of millions of dollars as their individual fortunes, just as Ferdinand Lundberg told us. Why, queried the Socialists, concentrate attention on the instruments? That's what I've been saying for so long. Why not, said they, attack the power of the whole social, political, and industrial system, of which the political boss was merely one expression? This system, according to the Socialist Party, was the capitalist system for the overthrow of which they declared and agitated. They pointed out that behind Mr. Murphy and Tammany Hall, as well as behind the Republican organization where it was in power, were traction, railroad, telephone, electric lighting, industrial, and other financial interests, all selfishly utilizing the power embodied in political bosses for their own ends and aggrandizement, and that these were the real powers that could make and unmake political bosses. Thank you, Gus, for calling it like it is. Somebody finally did. Gaffney, Cram, and Plunkett had all denied allegations aimed at them. Murphy and McCall had remained silent, but on October 26, 1913, McCall and Murphy both issued statements. Mr. McCall denied the charge that he had paid $35,000 for the nomination for the Supreme Court in 1902. Mr. Murphy made public an affidavit in which he, Murphy, denied that McCall had ever paid him anything at any time, and branding the charge as false. On the next day, Mr. Murphy gave out a long statement, making a sweeping denial of Mr. Sulzer's statements. He asserted that he had received the $25,000 from Anthony N. Brady, but that he had returned the money the next day. He also denied that he had ever received $10,000 from Ryan. Mr. Hennessy returned to the attack. On the same day, he charged that a seat in the United States Senate to succeed Senator Root, had been offered to Sulzer if he would yield to Mr. Murphy, and that it was Mr. McCall who acted as the intermediary. In a public speech on the following day, October 28, 1913, Mr. Hennessy demanded the tracing of Mr. Brady's $25,000 and suggested that it might be well to examine the executors of Brady's estate and find out whether Brady had deposited $25,000 2 days after Judge Beardsley had handed that money to Mr. Murphy. Mr. Hennessy went on, quote, "I knew Mr. Brady very well. I have known Mr. Brady since he was selling groceries in Albany 25 or 26 years ago. And I know that he never carried around $25,000 in bills every day in his pocket. So if he got this $25,000 in bills from Mr. Murphy, he undoubtedly deposited it somewhere," unquote. Mr. Hennessy chided Mr. Murphy with having been told by his district leaders to answer him after he, Murphy, had declared that he would not notice the charges, and said that Mr. Murphy was, quote, "shoving it off on a dead man," unquote. Oh, the guy's dead. Let's blame it on him instead of Kissinger or somebody. Continuing. When, on October 29th, 1913, former Judge Beardsley, counsel for the Brady estate, issued a statement asserting that the $25,000 was returned to Brady, Mr. Hennessy, in a public speech, demanded proof and charged that an alibi was being proved over the body of a dead man. Mr. Hennessy made the charge that in the campaign of 1910, Mr. Murphy had collected fully $150,000 for which he had not accounted in the statement filed with the Secretary of State. Mr. Hennessy declared, quote, "Most of this money came from contractors who were clubbed into giving it," unquote. So this exciting campaign drew to a close amid sensational charges, counter-charges, denials, and reiterations.